Hello and welcome to the Story Atelier, where we bring you tales full of emotion, drama, and unexpected twists, inviting you to uncover the deeper meanings hidden within each story. Today, we're diving into a powerful and heartwarming narrative that's as tragic as it is miraculous. A story of love, memory, and a journey to rediscover the pieces of a life once thought lost. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to come face to face with the love of your youth, the one you believed was gone forever? Today's story, millionaire recognizes waitress his youthful love, presumed dead 23 years ago, will take you on that very journey. Get ready for a tale of unexpected reunions, buried truths, and the resilience of the human heart. Let's uncover together what happens when fate gives two people a second chance at the love they thought was lost forever. Now, let's dive in. It was another sweltering morning in Atlanta, Georgia. Judge Olivia Carter adjusted the rearview mirror of her car, her heart racing as she glanced at the clock on her dashboard, 8:45 a.m. The trial was scheduled to start in 15 minutes, and she was cutting it dangerously close. Today wasn't just any trial. It was the opening day of one that could redefine the legal system's approach to racial bias across the state. Olivia parked hurriedly in her usual spot behind the courthouse. Despite the urgency, she paused to collect herself. A respected figure in the judiciary, Olivia Carter had been one of the youngest black women to ascend to a federal bench. But today, she wasn't just a judge. She was a symbol of change, and the weight of that responsibility sat heavily on her shoulders. She grabbed her briefcase, slinging it over her shoulder as she strode toward the courthouse. Reporters swarmed the front steps, cameras clicking incessantly, eager to capture any sign of drama surrounding the trial. Olivia opted for the quieter side entrance, a path she often used to avoid unnecessary distractions. As she approached the side door, she noticed a young police officer standing guard. His posture was rigid, his uniform crisp, and his gaze sharp. Something about his demeanor felt immediately confrontational. Olivia instinctively reached for the ID badge clipped to her collar, a habit formed through years of navigating security checkpoints. Before she could raise it fully, the officer stepped forward, blocking her path. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," he said, his voice curt and authoritative. Olivia frowned, holding up her badge. "I'm Judge Olivia Carter. I have court in less than 15 minutes." The officer's eyes barely flicked toward the badge. Instead, his gaze lingered on her face, his expression unreadable but undeniably tense. "There's been an incident in the area," he replied. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." Olivia's stomach dropped. The familiarity of this moment was both infuriating and heartbreaking. She had spent her entire career fighting against the biases embedded in the system. Yet here she was, facing the very same prejudice that had led to countless injustices. "Officer," Olivia said, keeping her tone calm but firm, "I don't have time for this. I'm presiding over a trial that starts shortly. Please, just check my credentials." But he didn't budge. If anything, his stance grew more rigid, and his hand hovered dangerously close to the handcuffs at his belt. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to answer a few questions," he insisted. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely uninterested in the truth. Olivia's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of his suspicion, the way he saw her not as a judge, but as a black woman who, in his eyes, fit some arbitrary description. Before the tension could escalate further, another voice broke through the standoff. "Is there a problem here?" Both Olivia and the officer turned to see a middle-aged black sergeant approaching. His badge gleamed under the morning sun and his expression was a mix of surprise and irritation as he recognized Olivia. "Judge Carter," he said, his tone incredulous. Olivia nodded, relief flooding her chest as the sergeant addressed the younger officer. "Stand down, McAllister. That's Judge Carter. The officer hesitated, his jaw tightening before he reluctantly stepped aside. "She matches the description," he muttered under his breath. The sergeant's voice hardened. "That's the presiding judge of today's trial. Do you want to explain to the chief why you delayed her?" McAllister said nothing, but his posture deflated slightly as he backed away completely. Olivia straightened her shoulders, brushing past him without another word. Her heels clicked against the pavement, each step a defiant reminder of her authority. Inside the courthouse, Olivia took a moment to steady herself. The sterile walls and polished floors of the building were familiar, almost comforting, but the encounter outside lingered in her mind. She had fought for decades to break barriers, yet days like this reminded her how much further there was to go. The courtroom was already bustling when she entered. The opening statements were about to begin, and all eyes were on her as she ascended to the bench. Olivia called the court to order, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Today's case centered around Marcus Jennings, a young black man who had been arrested for loitering in his own neighborhood. The officer who detained him claimed he looked suspicious, a word Olivia had come to loathe for its insidious use as a cover for racial profiling. Marcus's defense argued that his arrest was a clear example of systemic bias, and Olivia knew that her role as the presiding judge would carry weight far beyond this single case. As Marcus took the stand to share his testimony, Olivia leaned forward, her focus unwavering. His story was all too familiar: an innocent man, humiliated in front of his community, his life disrupted because of a baseless assumption. Every word he spoke hit Olivia like a punch to the chest, echoing her own experiences. Halfway through his testimony, the back door of the courtroom creaked open. Olivia's heart sank as she recognized the figure walking in, Officer McAllister. The same man who had stopped her outside now stood before her, called to testify as a witness for the defense. Olivia's grip on her gavel tightened as she reminded herself to remain impartial. This wasn't about her, it was about Marcus and the countless others who had faced similar injustices. But as McAllister took the stand, Olivia couldn't ignore the irony. The very system she had dedicated her life to fixing was now on trial, just as much as Marcus Jennings was. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Officer McAllister adjusted his seat at the witness stand. His usually firm demeanor seemed to falter under the weight of the eyes now fixed upon him. Olivia Carter watched him carefully from the bench, her face an unreadable mask. This wasn't the same man who had tried to assert dominance at the courthouse door earlier that morning. Here, he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. The prosecutor, Elaine Turner, approached the stand, known for her relentless pursuit of justice. Elaine had built her career on exposing the cracks in law enforcement's handling of racial bias. Today, she was determined to make this case an example. "Officer McAllister," she began, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Can you walk us through the events leading up to Marcus Jennings' arrest?" McAllister cleared his throat. "I was patrolling the neighborhood when I noticed Mr. Jennings standing near the corner of Pine and Market. He appeared nervous, glancing around frequently. And that's what prompted you to approach him?" Elaine asked, tilting her head slightly. "Yes," McAllister replied, his voice steadying. "He matched the description of a suspect we were looking for, a male in a hoodie." Acting suspiciously, Elaine paused, allowing the courtroom to absorb his words. Then she stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Can you describe this suspect in more detail?" McAllister hesitated. "Black male, mid-20s, wearing a dark hoodie." Elaine nodded slowly. "And what about Mr. Jennings? How was he dressed that day?" McAllister shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He was wearing a hoodie, too." The prosecutor didn't break eye contact. "Anything else? Any distinguishing features that matched your description?" McAllister opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence hung heavily in the air, a testament to the shaky foundation of his justification. "Let me help you, Officer McAllister," Elaine continued, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "You approached Mr. Jennings because he was black, wearing a hoodie, and standing on a street corner. Isn't that correct?" "That's not," McAllister started. But Elaine didn't let him finish. "Isn't it true, officer, that Mr. Jennings was simply waiting for a ride?" she pressed. "That he wasn't acting suspiciously at all, but rather was just existing?" McAllister's jaw tightened. "I was doing my job. I acted on the information I had." "Information?" Elaine's voice rose slightly. "Or assumptions?" The murmurs in the gallery grew louder as McAllister's defense began to crumble. Olivia raised her gavel, silencing the courtroom, but her own emotions swelled beneath the surface. She couldn't help but draw parallels to her own encounter with McAllister earlier. The same dismissive gaze, the same presumptions, it was a cycle that perpetuated itself endlessly. Elaine stepped back, letting the silence do her work. Then, with precision, she delivered the final blow. "Officer McAllister, did you find anything illegal on Mr. Jennings? Any weapons? Drugs? Evidence of a crime?" "No," McAllister admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," Elaine said, turning to address the jury. "No further questions, Your Honor." Olivia nodded, gesturing for the defense attorney to proceed. Sarah Whitman, representing McAllister, rose to her feet. She was young, ambitious, and clearly nervous about the task ahead. Her job was to paint McAllister as a dedicated officer who had made an honest mistake, not a man driven by prejudice. "Officer McAllister," Sarah began, her tone gentle, "in your experience as a police officer, have you ever had to make split-second decisions based on incomplete information?" "Yes," McAllister answered, visibly relieved by the shift in tone. "And do you believe those decisions are always perfect?" "No," he admitted, his confidence starting to return. "But we do our best with the information we have." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "Thank you, officer. One last question. Do you believe your actions that day were motivated by race?" "No," McAllister said firmly. "I was trying to keep the community safe." Sarah turned to the jury, offering him a small, empathetic smile. "No further questions, Your Honor." As McAllister stepped down from the stand, Olivia's eyes followed him. She could see the cracks in his demeanor, the way his hands fidgeted at his sides. He wasn't entirely convinced of his own innocence. And that, more than anything, struck Olivia deeply. The day continued with more testimony. Neighbors from Marcus Jennings' community spoke of his character, describing him as a kind, hard-working man who often helped others. One woman, an elderly resident named Mrs. Calloway, shared how Marcus had mowed her lawn every weekend after her husband passed away. "He's not some criminal," Mrs. Calloway said, her voice trembling. "He's a good man who didn't deserve to be treated that way." The defense called a few witnesses as well, fellow officers who vouched for McAllister's dedication to his job. But their testimonies rang hollow, overshadowed by the glaring inconsistencies in McAllister's actions that day. By the time closing arguments began, the weight of the trial was evident in the courtroom. Elaine Turner delivered a fiery summation, her voice echoing with conviction. "This case isn't just about Marcus Jennings," she declared. "It's about a pattern of assumptions, of prejudice, of systemic bias that has gone unchecked for far too long. Officer McAllister may not see himself as a racist, but his actions tell a different story. And until we hold people like him accountable, this pattern will continue." The defense's closing argument was more subdued. Sarah Whitman urged the jury to consider McAllister's intentions rather than the outcome of his actions. She painted him as a man caught in an imperfect system, doing his best under challenging circumstances. But Olivia knew the truth wasn't so simple. Intentions mattered, yes, but so did impact. And the impact of McAllister's actions had been devastating, not just for Marcus, but for the community as a whole. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Olivia remained on the bench, her mind racing. She had presided over countless cases, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about the law, it was about the soul of the justice system itself. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the courthouse. Olivia watched as Marcus sat quietly with his lawyer, his expression a mix of exhaustion and hope. Across the room, McAllister sat alone, his head bowed, the weight of the trial visibly pressing down on him. For Olivia, the day's proceedings were a stark reminder of the long road ahead. Justice, she knew, wasn't just about verdicts. It was about changing hearts, minds, and systems. And that, she thought, was a battle worth fighting. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Reporters filled the gallery, their voices hushed but urgent, as they prepared to relay the outcome of the trial to a nation now captivated by the case. Outside, protesters held signs calling for justice, while others voiced support for law enforcement. The air was electric, charged with the weight of what was about to unfold. Judge Olivia Carter sat in her chambers, her fingers drumming lightly on her desk. A stack of legal briefs lay untouched beside her. No amount of preparation could alleviate the knot of tension in her chest. This wasn't just a trial, it was a moment that could shift the cultural conversation about race, policing, and accountability. A knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. Her clerk, Lydia, poked her head in, her expression somber but professional. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a verdict." Olivia nodded, rising from her chair and smoothing her robe. "Let's proceed." As she entered the courtroom, the buzz of conversation fell silent. All eyes turned to her as she took her seat at the bench. She glanced briefly at Marcus Jennings, who sat with his lawyer. His hands were clasped tightly, his knuckles white. Across the room, Officer McAllister sat alone, his posture slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor. "The court will now reconvene," Olivia announced, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. "Will the jury foreperson please stand?" A middle-aged woman with neatly tied gray hair rose, a folded piece of paper trembling in her hand. She glanced nervously around the room before looking up at Olivia. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Olivia asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, her voice wavering. "Please read the verdict." The woman unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words before she spoke. "In the case of Marcus Jennings versus the City of Atlanta, we, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Daniel McAllister, guilty of wrongful arrest and racial profiling." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marcus Jennings exhaled sharply, his lawyer placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. Olivia glanced at McAllister, whose face had gone pale. His hands gripped the edge of the table as though trying to anchor himself. The foreperson continued, her voice stronger now. "We also recommend disciplinary action and mandatory bias training for the defendant, with oversight by an independent review board." Olivia nodded solemnly. "Thank you." The court acknowledges the jury's decision. Sentencing will take place at a later date. This court is adjourned. She banged her gavel, and the room erupted into activity. Reporters scrambled to exit, their voices rising as they rushed to break the news. Marcus's family and supporters gathered around him, offering hugs and congratulations. McAllister remained seated, his gaze distant, as if he were trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Olivia stayed at the bench, watching the scene unfold. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like enough. For every Marcus Jennings who found justice, There were countless others whose stories would never reach a courtroom. As the room emptied, Marcus approached her, his lawyer trailing behind. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Judge Carter, I just wanted to say thank you." Olivia shook her head. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Jennings. I was simply doing my job." Marcus's eyes softened. "It's more than that. This case, it's about more than just me. It's about showing people that this system can change. That it has to change." Olivia nodded, her throat tightening. "I hope this is the beginning of something bigger." "It is," Marcus said firmly. "It has to be." He offered her a small, hopeful smile before turning to leave. Olivia watched him go, her chest heavy with both pride and the lingering weight of responsibility. Just as she was gathering her papers to return to her chambers, Officer McAllister approached the bench. His steps were slow and hesitant, his hands buried deep in his pockets. Olivia paused, unsure of what to expect. "Judge Carter," he began, his voice low and strained. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry." Olivia studied him carefully. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped under the burden of guilt. She could see the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability he had tried so hard to hide. "Sorry for what, Officer McAllister?" she asked, her tone measured. "For everything," he said, his voice breaking. "For what I did to Mr. Jennings. For what I did to you. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. My actions weren't just mistakes. They were wrong." Olivia remained silent, letting his words hang in the air. She had heard apologies like this before, some genuine, others performative, but there was something raw in McAllister's demeanor that suggested he had truly begun to understand the damage he had caused. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he continued, his voice trembling. I need to be better. I want to be better." Olivia leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Words are a start, Officer McAllister, but they mean nothing without action. If you're serious about change, then you need to confront the system that allowed this to happen. That enabled you." McAllister nodded, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I will, I promise." She watched him for a moment longer before nodding. "Good, because this isn't just about you. It's about all of us." As McAllister turned to leave, Olivia felt a flicker of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. Change wouldn't come overnight, but perhaps this was a step in the right direction. That evening, Olivia sat in her chambers, the courthouse quiet around her. The trial was over, but the work was far from finished. She thought about Marcus Jennings, about Officer McAllister, about the countless others who had been affected by the biases embedded in the system. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one that required constant vigilance, courage, and compassion. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave for the day, Olivia Carter made a silent vow to keep fighting, to keep pushing, and to never stop demanding better. Because that, she knew, was the only way to truly make a difference.